The report arrived on a Tuesday, which was fitting, because Tuesdays on Confederation Station Orval were traditionally slow. No diplomatic crises, no trade disputes, no emergency resolution requiring three species to agree on the definition of the word immediately. Tuesdays were for filing for minor clerical updates, and for the kind of bureaucratic routine that kept the galaxy's largest governing body from collapsing under the weight of its own complexity. Senior archivist Drell Vassoon had worked in the Confederation Medical and Biological Assessment Division for 31 standard years. He had cataloged tissue samples from over 400 recognized species. He had documented bone density variations across 17 subspecies of Korathi alone. He had once spent an entire year writing a comprehensive index of Polari respiratory anomalies, a document which precisely 3 people had ever read, one of whom was him. He was not a man who startled easily. When the forensic packet from the human embassy incident landed in his queue, he almost didn't open it. The accompanying summary said only, biological samples recovered during structural collapse, human origin, routine assessment requested. The incident itself had been minor by galactic standards. A section of the human embassy's lower corridor had given way during a seismic event. 2 humans had been caught beneath falling debris. Both had survived and been transported to the medical center, and the case had been filed under Incident Category 7, which was the bureaucratic way of saying, handled, boring, move on. Drell opened the file because he was thorough. He had always been thorough. He read the first page, then he read it again. Then he closed the file, stood up from his workstation, walked to the small window that looked out over the station's central atrium, stood there for approximately 40 seconds, and walked back to his desk. He opened the file a third time. The numbers were the same. He pulled up the comparison database, the one that held baseline structural data for every cataloged species in the Confederation. He cross-referenced the human samples against 32 other species of comparable size and mass. He ran the density calculations twice using different models. He checked whether the samples had been contaminated, mislabeled, or mixed with material from another species. They had not. He sat back in his chair. After a moment, he typed a message to his supervisor, Chief Medical Analyst Sorvith Alan, and in the subject line he wrote 4 words that he had never written before in 31 years of archival work. You need to see this 3 levels above the archive division, in a conference room that smelled faintly of recycled air and Korathi ceremonial resin. The Confederation Council's Standing Committee on Species Integration was in the middle of what its chair, Representative Ilith Morn of the Pelari, privately called the human question. The human question had been on the committee's informal agenda for approximately 2 standard years, ever since humans had formally joined the Confederation and begun the process of integration. It was not a hostile question. The committee was not hostile. Most of its members were, in the measured diplomatic way that career politicians tended to be, genuinely interested in helping humanity settle into its new role. The problem was that humans were confusing, not in their behavior, which was certainly unusual, but in their classification. The Confederation's integration protocols were built around a set of physiological and cognitive assessments designed to categorize new member species and identify their needs, strengths, and the kinds of roles they were best suited for. It was a practical system. It worked reliably. A species' physical parameters told you a great deal about where they would thrive. Humans, according to every assessment the committee had run, were fragile. This was not an insult. Fragility was a classification, not a judgment. The Lethrian were fragile. The Sovani were fragile. Several of the most respected diplomatic species in the Confederation had fragility ratings in the high range, and they had built extraordinary civilizations based on their particular strengths. There was no shame in it, but it did create a logistical problem. The Confederation had a number of roles that required physical resilience, high stress tolerance, and what the assessment forms called structural durability. Mining operations, deep space repair crews, emergency response teams, Death World Colony Administration. These roles were reserved as a matter of policy for species whose bodies could handle the demands. And based on every number the committee had, humans did not qualify. Representative Morn had just finished explaining this, gently and with considerable diplomatic care, to the human liaison seated across the table, a woman named Dr. Senna Okafor, who had the particular quality of listening to things very quietly while her eyes remained absolutely still. "We want to offer humanity meaningful integration," Representative Morn said, "but we also have a responsibility to ensure that assignments are appropriate. The assessment results place humans in Category 4 resilience. This is not a limitation we're imposing. It's simply a function of biology." Dr. Okafor looked at her for a moment. "What specific metrics are you using?" she asked. "Standard protocol. Bone density, tissue elasticity, cardiovascular stress thresholds, recovery time from physical trauma." "And you tested living subjects?" "We used the standard sample analysis. It's the same protocol applied to all species." Dr. Okafor looked at the table for a moment. "Who conducted the analysis?" "Division 6. Biological assessment, I see." She paused. "I'd be interested to see the raw data." Representative Morn smiled politely. "Of course, we can arrange access through the standard information sharing channels." It typically takes. The door to the conference room opened. A junior aide stepped in, looking slightly uncertain, the way junior aides looked when they had been told to interrupt a committee meeting and had weighed the consequences of doing so and decided the alternative was worse. "Apologies," he said. "There's an urgent message for the chair from Chief Analyst Sorvith Alan in Division 8. He says it's regarding the human biological file." "He says it's," the aide glanced at his datapad. "He says it's a matter requiring immediate committee attention." Representative Morn looked at the aide. Then she looked at Dr. Okafor. Dr. Okafor's expression had not changed. "Send it through," Representative Morn said. Sorvith Alan had not intended to walk to the committee conference room himself. He had intended to send a summary document and let the bureaucratic process handle it from there. But after reading Drell's full report and spending 40 minutes on the phone with two of the Confederation's most senior xenobiologists, both of whom had reacted in ways that suggested summary documents were not going to be sufficient, he had decided to go in person. He stood at the head of the conference table with the full analysis displayed on the room's central screen, and he said, "I want to be very clear before I present these findings that our methodology has been verified 3 times, and the samples were confirmed human origin through genetic sequencing. There is no error in the data." The committee members watched him. Dr. Okafor watched him. "The samples recovered from the embassy incident," Sorvith said, "were taken from 2 humans who had been struck by falling debris. The structural collapse involved an estimated 400 kilograms of sealing material impacting over a period of approximately 6 seconds. Both individuals sustained what our trauma models classify as significant physical impact." He pulled up the first scan. "This is a cross-section of a human femur. The femur is the large bone in the upper leg. In our initial Category 4 assessment, we used standard sample analysis which measured surface density at the outer cortical layer." He highlighted the outer ring. "This is what most species' bones look like. A relatively consistent density from the outer shell through to the trabecular interior." He changed the image. "This is the complete cross-section of the human femur from our recovered sample." The room was quiet. The bone on the screen did not look like the other image. The outer cortical layer was dense, measurably denser than the comparison samples beside it. But that was not what drew the eye. What drew the eye was the interior structure, a latticed architectural network of mineralized struts arranged in what the eye immediately recognized as a load-bearing pattern, not random, not the diffuse interior softness of most bipedal species, a structure that looked, to anyone who had ever seen an engineer's stress distribution diagram, exactly like a stress distribution diagram. Humans, Sorvith said, have the highest trabecular bone density of any non-armored, non-exoskeletal species in our database. The internal architecture of their long bones is specifically configured to distribute impact force across the greatest possible surface area. Their cortical bone is approximately 4 to 6 times denser than species of comparable mass and size. He paused. Our Category 4 rating was based on the outer cortical measurement, which in humans is actually their secondary layer. We were, to use a precise technical term, measuring the wrong part. Representative Morn said, "What does that mean in practical terms?" It means that the two humans who were struck by 400 kilograms of debris walked to the medical bay. One of them stopped on the way to help a maintenance worker who had dropped something. He looked at his notes. The attending physician described both individuals as uncomfortable but ambulatory. He rated their injuries as moderate bruising and one partial rib fracture. Which one of the humans declined treatment for on the grounds that, and I'm quoting, "it'll heal." Silence. A Polari, Sorvith said very carefully, would not have survived that collapse. Representative Morn's face had gone through several expressions in quick succession, arriving finally at something that looked like a person, reorganizing a fundamental assumption they had been carrying for a long time. "What is their actual resilience classification?" she asked. Sorvith pulled up the adjusted chart. The human bar extended well past the Category 4 line. It extended past Category 3. It extended past Category 2, past Category 1, past the high resilience marker, and came to rest at a point on the scale that the committee's assessment rubric labeled, with the kind of bureaucratic straightforwardness that occasionally produced unintentional comedy, Death Worlder adjacent. The room was very quiet. "There's more," Sorvith said. The second section of the report covered musculature. This was where Drell Vassoon, who had joined the meeting via communication link from his archive office and was sitting very still in his chair with the expression of a man who had not entirely finished being surprised, had made his secondary discovery. Human muscle fiber, it turned out, had a property that did not appear in the standard assessment rubric because no one had thought to look for it. Standard muscle assessment measured maximum sustained output, the kind of performance that could be maintained over a long period. Humans scored moderately on this metric. They were not the strongest sustained performers in the Confederation database. What the standard assessment did not measure was burst capacity, the ability of a muscle system to temporarily exceed its normal parameters under conditions of acute stress. "We discovered this," Drell said from the screen, while reviewing the medical scans of the embassy incident subjects. The attending physician noted that one of the humans, while trapped under debris, had moved a section of fallen ceiling that the physician estimated at roughly 230 kilograms. He paused. This was the human who later declined treatment for the rib fracture. Someone at the table made a sound. "We went back and reviewed the original assessment protocols," Drell continued. "Standard testing is conducted in controlled conditions. Calm, measured at normal baseline. Humans, under normal baseline conditions, perform at Category 4 strength metrics. However, human physiology has a secondary system. We are calling it the acute stress response enhancement, which, under conditions of extreme physical or emotional stress, temporarily increases muscle output by a factor that our initial measurements suggest is somewhere between 2 and 5 times baseline." He let that sit in the air for a moment. "The variance is large because we don't have sufficient data yet. We're working with what we have. But the lower bound is 2 times. Humans, in emergencies, are at minimum twice as strong as they are in normal conditions. Another committee member, a Korathi named Velsan, who had not spoken since the meeting began, said quietly, "That's not how biology works." "That's what I said," Drell replied. "I said it 3 times. Then I verified the data 3 times. I have stopped saying it." The third section of the report was the one that Sorvith had almost left out, because it was the section that had made the 2 senior xenobiologists go quiet on the communication link in a way that he found, even in retrospect, slightly unsettling. It was about pain specifically, It was about the human relationship with pain. Every species in the Confederation experienced pain. This was a biological universal. Pain was information, a signal that damage was occurring or had occurred, and the body needed to know. The practical effect of pain was that it discouraged the continuation of damage-causing activity. You hurt, so you stopped doing the thing that hurt. This was the purpose of pain, This was how it worked for every cataloged species. Humans experienced pain. The medical scans confirmed this. Their neurological pain response was, in fact, quite sensitive. They had pain receptors distributed across their bodies at a density comparable to several high-sensitivity species. The signal was strong. They felt it clearly. They continued anyway, This was the part that had silenced the xenobiologists. Not always, not without limit. But the medical records, the accident reports, the emergency response logs from every human-populated location that had filed data with the Confederation in the 2 years since human integration began, showed a consistent pattern. Humans, when motivated, continued functioning through levels of physical damage that should have, by every established biological model, caused behavioral shutdown. The human who had moved the ceiling debris had a fractured rib, The records showed this clearly. Moving 230 kilograms of material with a fractured rib was, from a pain signal perspective, something that the body should have refused to do, The pain signal would have been severe. The human had moved the debris because there was another person trapped underneath it. This appears to be motivationally mediated, Sorvith said, The data suggests that humans can, under certain conditions, continue physical activity through pain levels that would incapacitate most other species. The triggers appears to be purpose, specifically, the protection of others. Velsan said slowly, they override the pain signal. Not fully, they feel it. The physiological stress markers are clear, the signal reaches them. They choose to continue anyway, Sorvith looked at the screen. We do not have a precedent for this in the database. Representative Morn had been quiet for several minutes. She was looking at the human liaison, Dr. Okafor, who had been sitting at the far end of the table throughout the entire presentation, with her hands folded and her expression composed.
"Dr. Okafor," Representative Morn said, "did you know about this?"
Dr. Okafor considered the question. "I knew about some of it," she said. "We tend not to advertise the details because it tends to make other species uncomfortable." "Why?" "Because the most common reaction," Dr. Okafor said, with the slight, careful flatness of someone choosing their words very precisely, "is the one you're all having right now." The fourth section of the report, which Sorvith presented after a short break, during which 3 committee members stepped out to make private communications and then returned looking thoughtful, was about endurance. This one was simpler, The data was cleaner. The conclusions were less ambiguous. Humans, in terms of raw, sustained physical performance over time, were not exceptional. They were not the fastest. They were not the strongest, Over a short sprint, a dozen species would outpace them. In a test of maximum lifting capacity, they fell in the middle range. Over 20 hours, 30 hours, 40, the curve changed, Almost every species in the Confederation experienced exponential performance degradation after a certain point. The body ran out of resources. The systems began to fail, The species that were fastest over short distances were often the first to drop at the 30-hour mark because the metabolic cost of that performance was enormous and unsustainable. Humans degraded too. They were not immune to fatigue, but the rate of their degradation was anomalously slow. And when the database was queried for species that could sustain functional performance over long durations, species that could walk, work, and make complex decisions after 24, 36, 48 standard hours of continuous activity, the list was short, very short. Humans were on that list, near the top of it. There's a historical context for this, Drell said from the communication screen. We pulled some of the xenoanthropological data on early human history. Humans, on their homeworld, were persistence hunters. They could not outrun their prey. They were not faster, they were not stronger. What they could do was follow, for hours, for days if necessary. They would pursue until the prey exhausted itself and could no longer flee. He paused. The prey always exhausted first. The room was silent. They evolved to outlast things, Drell said. That's what all of this is. The bone density, the burst capacity, the pain tolerance, the endurance. It's a body designed to absorb damage, keep functioning, and outlast whatever it is hunting or being hunted by. Someone at the table said, very quietly, we classified them as fragile. We measured the outer shell, Sorvith said. We measured the wrong part. What happened after the meeting is a matter of Confederation record, though the record is considerably drier than the reality. In the record, the Standing Committee on Species Integration formally reopened the human physiological assessment and reclassified humanity from Category 4 resilience to resilience class exceptional, a category that, prior to this reclassification, contained exactly 2 other species, both of whom were recognized deathworlders with notable exoskeletal armor. The new classification triggered automatic reassessment of human role eligibility, which meant that the list of Confederation positions formerly closed to human applicants became overnight very short. Dr. Okafor submitted a politely worded follow-up document, noting that humanity would appreciate the same access to deep space operations, emergency response corps, and colony administration roles that other resilience-class species enjoyed, and that they had in fact been quietly operating in several of these roles through informal arrangements for the past 18 months, and formal recognition would simply allow them to stop pretending otherwise. This last sentence was not in the formal document. It was in a note appended to the document, addressed to Representative Morn personally, and it was written in a tone that Morn would later describe to colleagues as the most precisely polite thing she had ever read. Archivist Drell Vassoon did not attend the formal reclassification ceremony. He was in his office, which was where he preferred to be, working through the secondary implications of the forensic report. There were many secondary implications. He had started a list. The list was currently 27 items long. In 12 was review all historical records of human combat and emergency response data, and reassess whether the outcomes that were previously classified as statistically improbable were in fact improbable at all. Item 17 was determine what the upper limit of human physical response actually is. Given that every test conducted so far had been under observation, and humans in the report showed a consistent pattern of underperforming in controlled conditions relative to their documented emergency performance. Item 23 was find out whether any of the humans currently assigned to low-intensity roles were aware that they were not being assigned those roles because of their capabilities. He suspected they were aware. The one who had declined treatment for the rib fracture had, according to the physician's notes, smiled slightly when informed of the Category 4 classification and said, "I see," in a tone the physician had described as pleasant. Drell read that note 3 times. Item 28, which he added while reading it, was, learn more about what humans considered pleasant. The full forensic report was distributed to all Confederation member species, medical and diplomatic archives 6 weeks after the committee meeting. The distribution was standard protocol. Reports of this nature went out routinely. Most were read by archivists, filed, and forgotten. This one generated 47 formal requests for follow-up study. The Korathi Biological Academy submitted a research proposal to conduct a comprehensive reassessment of human physiology. The Polari Medical Collective sent a diplomatic inquiry asking whether any humans would be willing to participate in a voluntary long-term study. Several species whose home territories overlapped with human settlement zones quietly contacted their intelligence services and asked for updated assessments of human population distribution and infrastructure. The Varag Confederation, whose territory shared a border with a human colonial cluster, pulled the report, ran their own analysis, and then had a very long internal conversation that their diplomatic correspondents referred to only as a strategic reassessment of neighbor relations. None of this made the official record in any form that was easy to find. 3 months after the meeting, Representative Ilith Morn of the Polari was traveling on a Confederation transport that experienced an unexpected hull breach in a secondary cargo section. It was not a dangerous breach. The automated systems handled it. No one was at risk, but there was a moment before the automated systems responded when a loud decompression alarm sounded and the transport shuddered, and in that moment, Representative Morn watched the 2 human security officers standing at the corridor intersection near her cabin. Every other person in the corridor flinched. She flinched. It was a natural response, sudden noise, physical shock, the body doing what bodies do. The 2 humans did not flinch, they moved. Before the second alarm tone had finished sounding, they had already shifted position, one of them placing himself between the corridor junction and the representative, and 2 other Polari diplomats, the other already in communication with the ship's crew, hand on the sealed interior door, posture alert, completely calm. Not calm in the way of someone forcing themselves to be calm. Calm in the way of someone who was doing what their body knew how to do and was entirely comfortable doing it. The breach was handled in 40 seconds. The alarm stopped. The transport continued on course. The 2 security officers returned to their posts and resumed the quiet, patient posture they maintained during normal hours. Representative Morn stood in the corridor for a moment. She thought about the forensic report. She thought about the bone cross-section on the screen, the latticed interior that looked like an engineer's stress diagram. She thought about the human who had moved the ceiling debris with a fractured rib. She thought about the phrase that Drell Vasoon had used, they evolved to outlast things. She looked at the human security officer who had placed himself between her and the source of the alarm. He caught her looking and gave her a small, polite nod, the kind of nod that said, "No trouble, all handled, you're fine." She nodded back later. In her cabin, she opened a secure channel to her office and left a recorded message for her aide. "Pull everything we have on human history," she said. "Everything. Pre-contact, post-contact, the xenoanthropological files. I want to understand how they got here." She paused. "And I want to understand how we missed it." The answer to the second question, when her research team delivered it 4 weeks later, was both simple and uncomfortable. They had missed it because they had looked at humans and seen something small. Something without armor, without venom, without the immediately visible markers of danger that the Confederation's threat assessment system had been built to recognize. Something that breathed too quickly and ran slower than half the species it shared its world with, and had bones that looked, from the outside, like any other terrestrial biped. They had looked at the outer shell. They had measured the wrong part. The Confederation's integration assessment rubric had been designed over centuries, refined through experience with hundreds of species. It was a good system. It had worked reliably. The problem was that it had never encountered a species that looked vulnerable and wasn't. Every dangerous species in the database had legible danger. You could see it. Armor, claws, size, speed. The markers were visible, and the assessment system read them accurately. Humans had none of those markers. What they had was hidden inside, in the architecture of their bones and the chemistry of their muscles and the particular configuration of a nervous system that had learned, over millions of years of being the prey as often as the predator, to keep going when everything in the environment said stop. The report's conclusion, written by a Polari researcher who had spent 4 weeks reviewing human evolutionary history and had emerged from the process looking, by her colleagues' accounts, somewhat altered by the experience, read as follows. Humanity does not signal its capabilities. This is not a diplomatic or strategic decision. It is biological. The species did not evolve in an environment where showing strength was advantageous. They evolved in an environment where looking unremarkable kept them alive. The strength was always secondary. The endurance was always primary. They survived not by being the most dangerous thing in a given environment, but by being the last thing standing in it. This pattern appears to have transferred, without modification, to their interstellar context. They arrived at the Confederation. They waited. They filled the roles they were given. They did not correct the assessments. And when the forensic data finally revealed what was actually there, the gap between the Confederation's model of humanity and the reality of humanity was large enough to reclassify them entirely. The researcher had added a final line that her department head had suggested removing on the grounds that it was editorializing. She had declined to remove it. It read, "We should be grateful that the first encounter with their actual capabilities involved a ceiling and not a conflict." Drell Vassoon eventually stopped adding items to his list at 39. 39 felt like a manageable number. He submitted the list to his department head as a proposal for a 5-year research initiative with a budget request attached. The budget was approved in 3 days, which was the fastest any research budget had been approved in Division 8's recorded history. He began the work the following morning. The first thing he did was contact the human embassy and ask, through the appropriate diplomatic channels, whether any humans would be willing to participate in a comprehensive voluntary physiological study. The response came back in 6 hours. It said, "We'd be happy to help. We've been wondering when you'd ask." Drell read that message. He saved it. He was not sure why it made him feel the way it did. It was a polite, cooperative response. It was the kind of thing you said when someone asked for help. There was nothing remarkable about it, but he had been thinking, for 3 months, about the forensic report, about the bone density and the burst capacity and the pain tolerance and the endurance, about the human who declined treatment for the rib fracture and said it'll heal, about the security officer who moved before the second alarm tone finished, about 39 unanswered questions and a research initiative that would take 5 years and probably still not cover everything, And he had been thinking about what the researcher had written. They did not correct the assessments. He read the message again. "We've been wondering when you'd ask." He closed the file. He started his research notes. Item 1 on his list was the most basic question. It was the question he should have asked at the beginning, before any of the bone scans or the muscle data or the pain tolerance findings aired, before the committee meeting and the reclassification and the budget approval. It was the question that should have been asked by the first Confederation assessor who encountered a human 2 years ago or 5 years ago, or whenever this whole process had started. The question was, what else are we measuring wrong? He had a theory. It was not a comfortable theory. It had been forming slowly over the 3 months since the forensic report, building piece by piece from the data and from the documents. his research team kept returning with when he sent them to review the historical human contact file. The theory was not about bones or muscles or pain thresholds. Those were physical facts. The theory was about something harder to measure. The Confederation's assessment rubric had been built, as he had come to understand, around a particular assumption. The assumption was that capability signaled itself. That species who were strong looked strong. That species who were resilient showed resilience. That the markers of what a species could do would be visible to an outside observer who knew what to look for, and that the Confederation's assessment system, refined over centuries, knew what to look for. This assumption had worked because it had always been true. Every species that was physically exceptional had been visibly, obviously exceptional. You looked at the Varag and you understood, immediately and without any analytical tools, that you were looking at something dangerous. You looked at the armored Karathi warriors and you felt the specific biological response that predators triggered in smaller creatures. The galaxy had a consistent relationship between visible form and actual capability, and the assessment system had learned to read that relationship accurately. Humans broke the relationship not intentionally, not strategically. They had simply evolved in a context where looking unremarkable was a survival advantage, and the result was a species that carried exceptional capabilities inside a body that read, to every external assessment system in the galaxy's history as ordinary, as moderate, as Category 4. And now, Drell was sitting with 39 research questions and the slowly accumulating suspicion that the physical findings, extraordinary as they were, might not be the most significant thing about humanity. He thought about the phrase Dr. Okafor had used at the committee meeting when asked why humans hadn't corrected the assessment results. They tend to make other species uncomfortable. She had known. She had sat at the end of that table and watched the committee apply a Category 4 resilience rating to her species and had not said a word, because she had understood what the reaction would be when the truth eventually surfaced. She had calculated, probably before the meeting began, that correcting the assessment would create a problem, and that not correcting it would simply delay the problem until there was data to support it, at which point the problem would be easier to manage. She had been right. Drell added a 40th item to his list, assess human strategic cognition and long-term situational modeling capacity. Then he thought about it for a moment and moved item 40 to item 1. The research initiative officially began 6 weeks after the budget approval, which was a record for interdepartmental processing speed that Drell was fairly confident would stand for some time. The first human volunteers arrived on a Thursday. There were 12 of them, a carefully selected group representing diverse physiological profiles, according to the covering note from Dr. Okafor's office. Drell had spent considerable time preparing the initial assessment protocols. He had revised them 4 times, adding tests that the standard rubric didn't include, removing tests that seemed redundant given what they now knew. He met the group in the reception area outside Division 8's primary lab complex. They looked entirely ordinary. This was, he had come to understand, the point. He had read enough of the historical files to know that this was always the point. Humans in a new environment looked like they belonged there, or if they didn't quite belong, they looked like they were working on it, quietly, without drawing attention. They did not carry themselves the way species who knew they were exceptional carried themselves. They carried themselves like people who had somewhere to be and were getting on with it. He introduced himself. They introduced themselves. The exchange was polite and efficient. One of the humans, a man named Gregor, shook Drell's hand in the particular human contact greeting, and Drell, who had been briefed on the custom, shook back. Human hands, he noted, felt like ordinary hands. Of course they did. We're ready whenever you are. Gregor said. Drell looked at his research notes. 40 items. 5 years of work, minimum. And a strong suspicion that 5 years would produce 30 more items, and the work would continue beyond that, possibly for a very long time. Let's begin, he said. He had decided that item 1 was the right place to start. Before the endurance trials and the strength assessments and the pain threshold measurements aired. Before all of it, he was going to ask them to think through a complex problem and explain their reasoning out loud. He was going to listen. He suspected, in the particular careful way that 31 years of scientific work had taught him to suspect things he couldn't yet prove, that the most significant discovery of this entire initiative was not going to be biological. He suspected it was going to be about what happened when an organism that looked ordinary applied its mind to a problem. He suspected, based on 40 items and 3 months of questions and one message that said, "We've been wondering when you'd ask," that the gap between what the Confederation thought it knew about humanity and what was actually true was very large, larger possibly than the bones. He picked up his assessment tools. He began. The first session lasted 4 hours. By the third hour, Drell's research assistant, a young Pelari named Sova, who had joined the initiative 6 days earlier with the particular enthusiasm of someone who had just received their first major assignment, had stopped taking notes in the standard format and started writing in the margins. The problem Drell had given them was not unusual. It was a logistics and resource management scenario, the kind of thing the Confederation used routinely in administrative assessment. Given a set of constraints, a set of resources, and a time limit, identify the most efficient path to a specified outcome. Straightforward, well-established baseline data existed for almost every Confederation species. The humans worked through it differently, not incorrectly, not in ways that produced worse outcomes. That much was clear almost immediately. They produced outcomes that were, in fact, better than the baseline averages by a meaningful margin. But the path they took to get there was not what Drell had expected. Most species approached the problem systematically, working through variables in order of significance, building toward a solution incrementally. It was logical. It reflected how complex problems were generally managed. The humans worked the problem from multiple angles simultaneously, assigning members of the group to approach it from different directions, and then pooling the partial solutions and finding where they intersected. They talked while they worked, and the conversation was not structured in the way that most species' collaborative reasoning was structured. It moved quickly. It doubled back. It included observations that seemed tangential and then turned out to be directly relevant. It included what Drell could only describe as deliberate mistakes, or rather, deliberate explorations of incorrect paths which were apparently being tested for the specific purpose of confirming they were incorrect and then discarded. They were running what Sova later called, in the margin notes that became one of the most cited documents in the initiative's first year, a parallel search through solution space. Not sequential, not hierarchical, parallel, multiple approaches operating simultaneously, competing and cooperating at the same time, the group functioning like a single distributed system that could hold several contradictory possibilities at once and assess them simultaneously rather than one at a time. When they reached the answer, they did it together, and quickly the solution emerging from the collective process, the way a shape emerged from a pattern, suddenly visible once the right pieces were in the right arrangement. Gregor said, "I think that's it," and 3 others confirmed it within seconds, and one person said, "Check the secondary distribution path," and there was a brief exchange that lasted 40 seconds, and then they all agreed. The total time was considerably faster than the baseline average. Drell sat with his assessment notes and looked at his item 40 move to item 1 question. Assess human strategic cognition and long-term situational modeling capacity. He made a notation beside it. Initial observation. They are not thinking sequentially. They are thinking in parallel networks. This is not a learned technique. They do it naturally, the way other species breathe. The baseline assumption that cognition follows a linear path may not apply here. He looked up at the group, who were now discussing among themselves what they thought the exercise had been measuring, a conversation that was open and apparently genuine rather than strategic, and which was already generating secondary insights about the problem that went beyond what the assessment scenario had asked for. He wrote, follow-up question. Do they always do this? Or is it specific to group contexts? Then below that, follow-up to the follow-up. If they do this individually, how? The margin notes were getting long. Sova was still writing. The humans were still talking. Drell thought again about the forensic report, about the bone cross-section, about the latticed internal architecture that looked like an engineer's stress distribution diagram. He thought about what that meant as a metaphor, because he was finding increasingly that human things worked as both physical facts and metaphors simultaneously, which was itself a thing he was going to have to add to the list at some point. The interior was different from the exterior. The outer shell read one way. The inside was structured differently, specifically, functionally, designed for a purpose that wasn't visible until you cut through to where the actual architecture lived. He looked at the 12 humans across the assessment room. They looked like ordinary people having a conversation. He picked up his stylus. He added item 41. Determine whether the distributed parallel processing pattern in group cognition has a documented evolutionary origin, and if so, whether it relates to the same persistence hunting adaptation that produced the endurance physiology intin 42. Determine whether the deliberate exploration of incorrect paths is a cognitive feature rather than a bug, and if so, what it implies about how humans process uncertainty 43. And he wrote this one slowly, because it felt important in a way he couldn't yet quantify. Determine why a species that spent its first 2 years in the Confederation being categorized as Category 4 resilience never corrected the record, and whether that patience is itself a capability. He capped his stylus. Gregor looked over at him. Is there another one? He asked. He was asking about the assessment exercise. He was asking it in the straightforward, collaborative way, the we're ready if you are tone, not impatience, but simply presence, simply availability. Drell looked at item 43. Yes, he said. There's another one. He picked up the next assessment scenario. Outside the lab window, the Confederation station hummed with the ordinary traffic of 1,000 species going about their ordinary days. Treaties being negotiated, trade routes being mapped, small disputes being managed, and larger ones being prevented through the accumulated diplomatic machinery of centuries. And in a room in Division 8, 12 people who looked entirely ordinary were demonstrating, for the 43rd time in as many minutes, that the most important things about them were not visible from the outside. The report, when Drell eventually wrote it, ran to considerably more than 39 items. It concluded in its final paragraph with a line he worked on for 3 days before he was satisfied with it. It read, the initial assessment classified humanity as fragile. The forensic data forced a reclassification. What this initiative has found is that the physical reclassification, significant as it is, may prove to be the smaller correction. The Confederation measured humanity's outer shell and found it ordinary. The interior in every domain we have examined is something else entirely. We recommend continued study. We recommend also that the Confederation's assessment rubric be reviewed comprehensively, with particular attention to the assumptions built into it about the relationship between visible form and actual capability. Humanity did not break those assumptions. It simply revealed that they were assumptions. He submitted the report on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate. He was not sure what came next. He had 43 items, aired, a 5-year mandate, and 12 humans who showed up every Thursday and worked through whatever he gave them with the same patient, quiet, aired, unhurried competence that he had come to recognize as the specific texture of how they approached most things. He had also come to understand, finally and with certainty, aired, what Dr. Okafor had meant when she said that the truth about humanity tended to make other species uncomfortable. It wasn't the strength, or the endurance, or the bones, it was the patience, aired. The Confederation had had humanity in a box for 2 years. Category 4, moderate, fragile, suitable for certain roles, not others. A known quantity, humanity had waited, had worked within the box, had been helpful, aired, cooperative, present. And when the ceiling fell, the forensic report was what it was, and the box turned out to have been the wrong size all along. They had simply looked up and said, "We've been wondering when you'd ask," aired. In a tone that was entirely pleasant. 31 years of archival work, Drell had cataloged 400 species. He had never encountered one that weighted that well. He closed his notes, aired. He started preparing Thursday's assessment.